Hi, everybody. I'm Aileen Lynch. We're going to get started. I just want to welcome everybody here. We've got about 18 people here in the space, and we have about 44 people online, and that's a record breaker for us. My name is Aileen Lynch. I work here at the museum on programming and development. This is our third in a series of talks that were created to bring awareness to an appreciation for the legacies of some of New Jersey's most history-making women. And today's talk is on Millicent Fenwick, and we have Millicent Fenwick's biographer here. She wrote the definitive biography of Millicent Fenwick, and it's also kind of a special event because we have Millicent Fenwick's grandsons are joining us in the Zoom broadcast. So hopefully they'll be able to participate later on, Sam, Jonathan, and Joseph. Next talk will be November 7th. That's a Saturday at 4 p.m. And that will be Amy Gilman-Shrebnick. And she is going to talk from her book, The Mysterious Death of Mary Rogers, about the murder of the cigar girl who was found murdered on, she washed up by 11th and River Road. And that case became the inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's The Mystery of Marie Roget. So I also want to mention that this series has been funded by the New Jersey Council of the Humanities. They gave us a very generous donation to offer this for free. That's why it's at no cost. We also want to thank the New Jersey Historical Commission, who give us a generous general operating support grant every year. Today's talk is by Amy Schapiro, and Amy is a native of New Jersey, and her book grew out of a research project that she started for her college thesis at American University. Amy currently works in Washington, D.C. Everybody, Amy Schapiro.
Thank you so much, Eileen, and the Hoboken Museum for hosting this today, as well as the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. I'm honored to be a part of this lecture series and to talk about Millicent Fenwick. What's fun for me about being in Hoboken today, and for those of you that are here in person, I think you probably know a lot about Hoboken history, and that wasn't something I knew much about when I started this project. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Stevens family because they were key players in the founding of Hoboken. Many of you know about Stevens Institute of Technology here in Hoboken, and what some of you probably know is Millicent Fenwick is a descendant of the Stevens family. And what I was surprised to learn when I was doing my research about Millicent was that as someone who grew up here in New Jersey, I had never heard of the Stevens family before. And there are several generations, at least 4 generations of Stevens that I'm going to talk to you about today, just a little bit before we get to Millicent Fenwick, so you can kind of see her storied history and family history on her mother's side. So with that, I'm going to go to our first slide. As I mentioned, there are 4 generations of Stevens that I'm going to talk to you about, and all 4 of them are named John Stevens. So that makes it a little confusing. The first 2 John Stevens, I don't have pictures of. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them. The first John Stevens to come here to New Jersey, actually he came to New York, and he was an indentured servant in New York working for a lawyer in New York for the Royal Crown. So he worked in New York for 7 years, and then after he was done with his term, he went to New Jersey, and in New Jersey, he met and married Anne Campbell. And Anne Campbell's father had a lot of land, and when he died, John Stevens, the first John Stevens, who, as I mentioned, came here in 1699, he was just 17 years old at the time. So he married Anne Campbell, and when her father died, he inherited 2,000 acres of land in New Jersey. So that's really how the family started accumulating its wealth, was through land and land ownership. He had several children, and one of them was John Stevens. That John Stevens is commonly referred to as Honorable John. Honorable John, I don't have a picture of, but Honorable John was very involved in New Jersey politics, just as Millicent Fenwick was many years later, centuries later. And he was also a landowner, he was a merchant, and he was involved in what ended up becoming the New Jersey legislature. He was also a member of the Continental Congress, and when New Jersey ratified the Constitution in December 1787, he was part of that effort. So that was Honorable John. Honorable John had several children, one of whom was Colonel John Stevens. And so that's who you can see up on the screen here. And some of you may be more familiar with Colonel John Stevens. He became popularly known in New Jersey as the treasurer on horseback. So Honorable John had also been treasurer, and during the Revolutionary War, Colonel John paid George Washington's troops via horseback. And so that's how he became known as the treasurer on horseback. He was also an inventor, a landowner, and he too had several children, one of whom was John Cox Stevens. John Cox Stevens, some of you may know, or you can gather from the picture up there, there's a yacht behind him. John Cox Stevens, oh, and I should say Colonel John Stevens married Rachel Cox, and she was a prominent woman in New Jersey. Her father, I think, also had connections to George Washington. The Stevens family did as well. They lived in New York, just across the street from where George Washington was in Bowling Green. So there was a lot of connections during the Revolutionary period with names that you would have heard of. So John Cox Stevens founded the New York Yacht Club, and some of you might have heard of America's Cup. Well, America's Cup received its name thanks to John Stevens. He won the first America's Cup, and his boat, his yacht, was America. And so that's how America's Cup got its name. Now, John had some siblings, one of whom was Edwin Augustus Stevens. Edwin Augustus Stevens was Millicent Fenwick's great-grandfather, and he founded Stevens Institute of Technology. So many of the John Stevens, as well as Edwin, were early inventors. So a lot of the things that we use today, they were pioneers in. For example, early steam travel with locomotives and boats here in Hoboken going across to New York. If any of you travel to Washington when things are more normal and the Smithsonian's are open, there is a whole bunch of steam engines and boilers and other things that are all attributed to John Stevens. If you go to the Library of Congress, there is a section that's called the Hall of Professions, and it's a mosaic ceiling with different professions that are highlighted. And there's an anchor, and that's for steam travel. And the Stevens family is represented there in the Library of Congress. So at its time, it was a very prominent family. And in fact, Edwin Augustus Stevens, I'm told that when he died, the Stevens family was the wealthiest family in America at the time. So certainly they had a lot of wealth, a lot of land, and were early contributors here, not just in Hoboken, but really to our whole nation. They also developed the modern day T-rail that we use on our railroad tracks. And when Edwin died, he bequeathed his, I think it was $750,000 to set up Stevens Institute of Technology. And at the time, most of the universities were focused on humanities, and they really needed a university to focus more on engineering and to get skilled workers to help them with all of their inventions. So now Edwin had a son. Let me go back. So Edwin had several children, of course, and of course, one of his children's names was John Stevens. John Stevens married a woman by the name of Mary Marshall McGuire. And I'm not giving you the full story, but there are a lot of Marys within this story as well. So John marries Mary Marshall McGuire, and they have one daughter, Mary Picton Stevens. And that's how we get to Millicent. Millicent's mother was Mary Picton Stevens. Mary Picton Stevens was said to be beautiful, like a porcelain doll. She had cream-colored skin and was just very beautiful in person. And she had a little bit of a tragic life as well. She was the only daughter, as I mentioned, of John and Mary, and her father, John, died when she was 10 years old. And when she was 19, her mother died. So at the age of 19, she was a millionaire. She had inherited all of that wealth and also lost both of her parents. She met her husband, Ogden Hammond, Millicent's father, through a friend in Bernardsville who had gone to Yale with Ogden. And Ogden and Mary married in 1907. And one thing I forgot to mention, John Stevens, let me think about this, Colonel John Stevens, built the villa in Hoboken. And it was this stately home mansion, really. And that's where all of the family functions were. It was written about. And unfortunately, that was lost to a fire after he died. His sons then rebuilt. And when they rebuilt the home, they called it Castle Point. And because that was where the view was, and that's what they had always called it. So Castle Point was an enormous estate, again, got a lot of attention in the media and the press. And when Edwin set up Stevens Institute of Technology, or helped found it, he left the Castle Point to Stevens Institute of Technology, where it was kind of the anchor of the university for decades, until 1959, actually. And in 1959, the university, without the family's support, decided to tear it down. And what made that especially heartbreaking was not only all of that history that was lost, but they had just 5 years earlier spent $100,000 renovating Castle Point. And that's where all of the portraits of the Stevens family hung on those walls and adorned those walls. And I imagine, or someone online, or certainly her grandchildren, in her Bernardsville home, there were a lot of portraits, and a lot of those portraits of her Stevens family ancestors hung on her walls in Bernardsville. So, things were saved, but at the same time, that caused quite a rift, as you can imagine, between the Stevens family and the university. So for a decade, there was no relationship between the Stevens family and the Stevens Institute of Technology. And then really what changed the course for that relationship was, I don't know if anyone here knows Richard Whitcomb, but he was the librarian, director of the library at Stevens Institute of Technology. He's someone I spoke with and interviewed for the book. He's a wealth of knowledge on the Stevens family. And he was really kind of served in a diplomatic role to kind of break the ice a little bit between the family and the university, in which there was a relationship that was rebuilt. And Millicent actually ended up going on to serve on the board of directors or trustees for the university. So she was supportive of it, not at the time that they knocked down the house, but later, thanks to Richard Whitcomb, he got a lot of the Stevens family on board. And I should say, for those of you that are interested in the Stevens family, there is a wonderful book that was written in 1928 about the Stevens family. I believe they might have commissioned the book, but it's wonderful. And that's how I learned so much about the Stevens family. There's so many primary resources available. My hope would be that someone like David McCullough would discover the Stevens family and really bring them to life, because I think they're really integral to not just the state, but really this country and its beginnings. And so there's a lot of information out there, and there's certainly a lot of accomplishments as well. And as you can see, the accomplishments continued through the generations. What you see on the screen right now is a picture of Mary, Millicent's mother, with her two daughters. She had 3 children. The oldest were daughters, Mary, who was born in 1908, and Millicent, the younger one, who was born on February 25th, 1910. Now, we all think of Millicent Fenwick as this lean, tall, graceful, statuesque individual. And when Millicent was younger, that's not how she thought of herself. She thought of herself as kind of a fat, messy, sloppy child. And although she doesn't look that way, that's how she described herself. And you can see her reading in a window. She always loved reading and books. Now, Mary, as I mentioned, married Ogden Hammond. And there's a picture of Ogden with his two daughters. They went on to have a third child, a son, who they named Ogden Hammond. So the three children were Mary, Millicent, and Ogden. And Ogden went on to become an ambassador to Spain. He was appointed by President Calvin Coolidge. And the family had a home in New York on the Upper East Side, and then Bernardsville was kind of their country home. And I don't remember if I mentioned this already, I might have, but Millicent's parents did get married at Castle Point in Hoboken, so that would be appropriate. And just as Millicent's family was critical to establishing Hoboken, Ogden and his family had a similar role in Superior, Wisconsin. So if you go to Superior, Wisconsin today, the main roads are called Ogden, Hammond, and John. Ogden's brother was John. So they also were pioneers in that part of the country. This is a picture of Millicent's childhood home. It at one point had 52 rooms. And when her father passed away in the 1950s, she eventually moved into the home. She tore most of it down and just preserved kind of one wing of the home, and that became Millicent's home. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen pictures of it, and so she really did live there most of her life on Mendham Road in Bernardsville. Unfortunately, tragedy struck the family at a young age, or Millicent at a young age. During World War I, Millicent's mother and the Stevens family were very philanthropic, and Millicent's mother wanted to go overseas to help victims of World War I. Ogden was opposed to this, but Mary was stubborn and determined to go overseas. Since Ogden could not persuade her otherwise, he decided to join her on this transatlantic journey with a philanthropic endeavor at the other end. Now, they were a wealthy family. They knew a lot of people, and Mary's Aunt Elsa knew the German ambassador, and the German ambassador had warned her not to let anyone you know sail on the Lusitania. What most people didn't realize was the German U-boats were starting to torpedo ships, and they didn't care if they were civilian ships or not. And nobody thought that the Germans would torpedo a civilian ship. And Cunard certainly didn't think they would do that either. It was Cunard was the ship line. So much like the Titanic, the Lusitania was considered a palace on the ocean. It had crossed the Atlantic approximately 200 times. It had more luxuries on board than many people did stateside. It had elevators, phones, electricities, grand ballrooms. And so the Hammonds booked a first-class passage on the Lusitania. As you can see from this headline, and I'm sure before you saw this picture, you know that the Lusitania was struck by a torpedo and sunk. As you can see by the headline, nearly 1,260 people died. Well, Mary and Ogden, as you know, were on that ship. Ogden was able to get themselves to a lifeboat, and thanks to the lessons of the Titanic, there were enough lifeboats on the Lusitania for everyone. Unfortunately, the torpedo hit the boiler room. So the boat listed in such a way that one side you really couldn't use the lifeboats, and on the other it was so far. So they got in the lifeboat, and no sooner had they gotten in, also I should say the staff hadn't really practiced drills. You know, they had done the same drill, getting in a lifeboat, but not practicing lowering it. So as one of the crewmen was lowering the boat, he lost his grip, and the boat dropped to the ocean. Ogden never saw Mary again. He bobbed in the water, and he was able to catch some debris, and he was in the water for a few hours before he was rescued. He was given brief hope about his wife, as there was a Mrs. Hammond in the hospital, but it turned out there was another couple traveling on board named Hammond, and that couple, the wife survived and the husband died. So at that time, Millicent was only 5 years old. Her sister was 7 and her brother was 3. Now, before they set sail, once everybody could not convince her, Ogden's brother John convinced Mary that she should sign a will. He asked if she had a will. She didn't. So he said, I'll draw one up for you. And she said, fine, come to the ship. So the day the ship set sail, May 1st, he came and she signed the will. That will created a trust for her 3 children and their unborn grandchildren. So that's where Millicent's wealth primarily comes from, is the trust created when her mother died in 1915. So fast forward a few years, Ogden remarried, and he remarried to a woman seated there named Daisy Howland. She had been widowed, and she had a son. The youngest boy in the picture is McClure Hammond, and the other 3 are Millicent, Ogden, and Mary. And while it looks like a nice photo, Millicent did not have a happy childhood under her stepmother's reign, really. She was very Victorian. She really didn't care too much about the 3 Hammond children. All of her efforts were focused on her son. Millicent referred to him as manure. So that shows you what she thought of him. So she really didn't have a nurturing home environment once her mother passed away. Well, before we get there, so I mentioned that her father was an ambassador to Spain. So the girls went with the family to Spain, and the boys stayed in boarding school in the United States. Her sister Mary had graduated from high school, but Millicent did not. She was about 15 at the time, and she was attending a boarding school, Foxcroft, in Middleburg, Virginia. So when the family moved to Spain, she did too, and she never graduated high school. And she never went to college either. Sometimes you'll see that she went to Columbia or the New School, and that's all true, but she took a class. She wasn't enrolled in a formal program. She always liked to learn and read and take in knowledge, but she had no high school diploma. So this is her husband, Hugh Fenwick, and as you can see, they married on June 11th, 1932. For those of you who have read the book, you know that this chapter is called Love, Scandal, Marriage. And that's because their marriage was quite a scandal, actually. When Millicent married, or met Hugh, I should say, he was already married. He was married to Dorothy Ledyard, and her father was the president of the New York Stock Exchange. And they weren't married that long, a few years, but at one point, Millicent was madly in love with Hugh, and she didn't know what to do. So she did something I don't think many of us would do. She went and saw Dorothy. And Dorothy was sick in bed with a fever when Millicent comes in and professes her love for her husband to her. Needless to say, Hugh and Dorothy get divorced, and Millicent and Hugh get married. Now, this did not go over too well with her very Victorian and very Catholic stepmother, Daisy. So Daisy tried to sabotage the wedding. It was a very small wedding held at the home. And anytime the photographer tried to take a photograph of the wedding, she would unplug the lights. So there are very few pictures actually of the wedding, and they're all outdoors, so with natural light. So you can see they married on June 11th, 1932. Hugh was described as quite the charmer. He had a very big personality. He was a pilot. He would take Millicent flying. She tried flying herself. She loved flying, but after a few airplane accidents in which she remained unscathed, but the planes did not. She quickly got banned from New Jersey airports, and nobody would let her take lessons there because they didn't want to lose a plane. So she was content being a passenger in Hugh's plane, and their honeymoon actually started off in their plane, and they were supposed to fly, I think, to the West Coast, but they didn't make it past Pennsylvania when they had a crash in Pennsylvania. I should say that there was also another crash. He was with the New Jersey National Guard, and he was the lead plane, and he decided to go low, and the other planes behind him followed. They didn't realize how close they were to the ground. They didn't have enough time to go higher, and so I believe there were 1 or 2 fatalities in that accident. And the reason why those 2 accidents are really vivid in my mind is been getting a lot of inquiries about Hugh Fenwick lately. One person was interested in the Pennsylvania crash and one was interested in the other crash. So he's definitely not forgotten. He was a larger than life figure, and he was also known to be quite a womanizer. In 1938, he went overseas to sell parts and airplanes for World War II, and he never came back. So that was a 6-year marriage. They didn't formally divorce until 1945, and they had 2 children, Mary and Hugh. For the purposes of the book, and it's hard now, but the son I always referred to in the book as Hugo, because as a child, that's what they called him, was Hugo. But as an adult, if you knew him, many of you probably did, he went on to become mayor of Bernardsville. He was Hugh Fenwick, and he was really very critical for me being able to do this book. He had given me the exclusive authorization rights to his mom's private papers, which were in the attic of the Bernardsville home where he lived. And so, I'm immensely grateful to him and the Fenwick and Reckford families for their cooperation. So next we have, this is a picture from Vogue magazine. So let me just tell you a little bit about how we get to Vogue magazine. So basically, Millicent Fenwick found herself in the 1930s and 40s as a single mother with 2 children, which really wasn't that common back then. Today, it's much more common. And while she had wealthy parents and was from a very wealthy family, she did not ask anyone for help or for money. So she decided she needed to get a job. And she went to New York, and it was raining. She went in Bonwit Teller, and she decided to ask for a job at Bonwit Teller. They interviewed her, and then they asked where she went to high school. And she didn't graduate from high school. So because she didn't graduate from high school, she was not eligible for a job at Bonwit Teller, and the interview ended right then. So she had no college degree, no high school degree, 2 children, and too much pride to ask anyone for help. The reason you might think, why would she need help if she inherited all of this money and this trust fund? Well, when Hugh left, he left her with a lot of debt. And the debt that he left her with was equivalent probably to a year's salary. And she paid his debts slowly and gradually. And she didn't know about any of them ahead of time, of course, but she honored those obligations and paid those debts. But in Millicent Fenwick's world, she had a friend named Minnie Astor, who was married to Vincent Astor. And Minnie Astor was in Newport at a dinner party, and she happened to sit next to Condé Nast, the publisher. And he said, I'm looking for some writers. Do you know anyone? And Minnie mentioned Millicent because she knew Millicent liked to write. And at that time, Millicent had sent 3 stories to an agent seeking to get published. And Minnie told this to Condé Nast. What neither Millicent or Minnie knew at the time was the agent had actually rejected those stories, and they were in the mail on the way back to her. But fortunately, that happened after this conversation in Newport. So Millicent interviewed, and she got a job as a caption writer at Vogue magazine in 1938. And that was the beginning of what would become a 14-year career. She ended up graduating from caption writing to actually writing some articles. This one is quite fun. She went, as you can see up there, on a 40-day journey to 17 South American cities. And she traveled with a renowned photographer named Tony Frizzell. And their assignment was really to kind of capture the pulse of society in South America. And it was a great, great journey. It really helped forge a lot of her beliefs on a variety of topics. And this is one of the articles that appeared in Vogue magazine about that trip. There was another article she wrote a year later called They Fly, and that profiled women pilots. And that was something she was very interested in because she really was mesmerized by Hugh and the flying and all of it. So that was another story she enjoyed doing. One other assignment that she did not enjoy at all was writing Vogue's Book of Etiquette. That was published in 1948, and you would think that it was a perfect assignment for her because she clearly grew up with a sense of etiquette, manners, nannies, all sorts of things, and diplomats. but she really didn't like the assignment, but she did it. And it was quickly a bestseller. I believe on the day it came out, the Soviet embassy purchased 400 copies. So it was a success. It rivaled Emily Post. And, I know people still refer to it today. And 4 years after she wrote Vogue's Book of Etiquette, she retired in 1952 to her Bernardsville home, where she kind of thought she would be a country gentlewoman, but that wasn't to be. She entered into politics. So even before she left Vogue, she had been involved in the school board in Bernardsville. She had also served on the Bernardsville Bureau Council. And in the 1960s, she was elected to the New Jersey State Legislature, where she served 2 terms. And here you can see she's smoking a pipe. And I really like this picture. There's a famous quote that many of you have probably heard, and it's from the New Jersey Legislature when they were debating the Equal Rights Amendment, and someone said that he thought of women as kissable and cuddly and smelling good. And Millicent Fenwick said, "I hope you haven't been as disappointed as often as I have." So she told that story often. And so I think this photo captures that perfectly. She served, as I mentioned, 2 terms, and then she was appointed to the Director of Consumer Affairs in New Jersey, which was also a perfect assignment for her. She always cared about her constituents and everybody's rights. So the consumer affairs position was perfect for her. But as many of you know, she didn't spend that long there before she decided to run for Congress. And here's a picture of her. Fenwick runs for Congress. Some of you, I'm sure many of you in the room and maybe some of you online have probably heard of Governor Tom Kean. And if you live in the state of New Jersey now, I don't, but I'm just here for this talk. I've seen the commercials on TV with Governor Tom Kean, and his son is running for re-election in the state legislature. Well, back in 1974, Tom Kean ran for Congress. Tom Kean Sr. ran for Congress against Millicent Fenwick for the primary in New Jersey. And Millicent Fenwick beat Tom Kean by a small margin of votes, less than 100 votes. And she went on to be elected. Now, what was unusual about her election? Several things were unusual and unprecedented about her election in 1974. One, she was 64 years old. She smoked a pipe. She was a grandmother, and she was a Republican elected in the wake of Watergate. While there was a whole body of new members of Congress that came in, I think very few were women and very few were Republicans. She might have been one of 18 Republicans, new Republicans elected that year. So with that, she went to Capitol Hill to become a member of Congress and serve the members of New Jersey. I have a quote up here, and there are a lot of Millicent Fenwick quotes online. I'm not really sure that they all are hers or not, but one of the things that she thought was very powerful was Hitler. And so she always said that that was why she was a Republican, because Republicans tend to ask why. And she also was against big government. So she seemed to think the Democrats were more big government, and she wasn't. So she was a Republican, and she often was asked why she was a Republican, because she did have some liberal leanings for the Republican Party. Now, obviously things are very different, but at the time, she was obviously a Republican and went to Washington. What the media captured in the headlines, oh, and I forgot to mention, so because of her age and the pipe and the grandchildren, the New York Times dubbed her victory a geriatric triumph, because in 1974, 64-year-olds weren't generally embarking on a new career. Now, of course, I don't think anyone would blink an eye, but back then it certainly was a novelty. And she really took Washington by storm. Every year there's a dinner for the new members of, featuring the new members of Congress, and she was one of the speakers selected that night, and she really made an impression on everybody that night. In fact, I think the book opens with a scene from that. But in my book, there are no pictures of Millicent Fenwick smoking a pipe. And that was very intentional. She knew that it was a bad habit, and she didn't want younger generations to replicate that bad habit. So she didn't like being photographed with a pipe. She tried not to. Of course, there are some pictures available, but she smoked a pipe because when she was younger, the doctor told her she had to quit smoking cigarettes. So she took him quite literally. She quit smoking cigarettes and she took up the pipe. And so there you have the pipe smoking grandmother in Congress. The other thing you might know about her is that she was the model for Lacey Davenport in Doonesbury. And so Lacey wore a hat and always said, "my dear," and there were a lot of similarities. Her staff quickly picked up on the similarities between this new character, Lacey, who seemed to emerge in Doonesbury around the same time that Millicent emerged in Washington. But she didn't right away see the connection between Lacey and herself until the staff pointed it out. But there's just another one here. And Gary Trudeau had actually given Millicent Fenwick one of the original drawings of the Lacey, of one of the Lacey comic strips, and it hung in her bathroom in her Bernardsville home. So I think they were both fond of it. So the thing about Millicent is many people think of her as stereotypical. Everybody thinks of her as the pipe smoking grandmother. And she always said she wanted people to think of her as the hardworking grandmother. It was the same number of syllables. And the thing that's incredible about her that many people don't know is as a freshman, she actually accomplished and passed major significant legislation that still exists today and is still in place today. Nearly 50 years later. What she did was she was passionate about human rights. And in 1975, she went on a trip to Russia with the Speaker of the House, Carl Albert, and others. It was a part of a congressional delegation, and she met with Leonid Brezhnev, as you see there, but she met with many Russian dissidents, and their stories really moved her. At the same time, on August 1st, around the same time, in August 1st, 1975, President Ford signed the Helsinki Final Act for the United States. Now, the Helsinki Final Act was not legally binding, but it really was really earth-changing in everything that was happening in the human rights field. And the reason why was there were 35 countries that signed it, 33 European countries, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had never signed anything like this before. They didn't sign the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, but they signed this. And so Millicent Fenwick thought that the United States needed to have a way of holding them accountable to follow through on the Helsinki Final Act, and particularly what was known as Basket 3, which was focusing on human rights, movement between countries, things of that nature. So she introduced legislation as a freshman to create the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And her vision was to have an equal number of Republicans and Democrats on this commission. And she also introduced having executive representatives from the executive branch on the commission, a representative from the Commerce Department, the State Department, and I believe it was the Defense Department. So that was not popular, particularly by folks like Henry Kissinger. So here you see Millicent Fenwick and Senator Clifford Case from New Jersey, who co-sponsored the bill on the Senate side. And this is a very small bill signing. We're used to seeing legislation being signed with a fanfare of people and everybody gets a pen. Very small, very intentionally small. And it was thought that it was designed to be small and signed to help with voters in New Jersey because 1976 was an election year, just like 2020 is. So very small fanfare, and this was signed. This is my favorite quote one of my favorite quotes in the book. The president signed the bill, said Henry Kissinger, only because I had not been told what was happening. I would have fought it to the death. He was not happy about this legislation. Particularly what upset him was he thought that this legislation would set precedent for future legislation in mixing the executive and legislative branches together on a commission. And although there were 3 executive branch representatives named in the legislation, called for, you needed the president to name representatives. So that was one step. Then there was a vice presidential debate, and this came up, both sides were told that, hey, they're going to bring this up during the vice presidential debate. And lo and behold, 3 representatives were named right around that time. But what they did was they compromised, and they said those 3 executive branch representatives will not have voting powers on the commission. The other thing was the commission, whereas Millicent thought it would be equal, it was a Democratic-led Congress at the time, so they made it unequal. There were more Democrats on the commission than Republicans. So she didn't get everything she wanted, but she did get this legislation passed. As I said, it's still in existence today, and now it's known as the Organization on the Commission and Security in Europe. So before it was the Commission, now it's a whole organization with all these countries. And they, so despite being Lacey Davenport, she really did have some legislative accomplishments, and this is, I think, one to be very proud of. And that's also something I should say. I was fortunate enough to interview President Ford for the book too, and this was one of the proudest things of his administration as well. At the time, he didn't get a lot of credit for it. He was lambasted in the news. I don't think that the US media portrayed it very positively, but in the end, his gut instinct was correct, and it did turn out to be a positive. This is a picture of Millicent surrounded by her staff in 1982. This was the last year that she served as a member of Congress. As a result of the census in 1980, New Jersey lost a seat in Congress due to redistricting, and she decided not to run for office in the Congress. She said she'd let her, I believe it was Representative Jim Corder, they shared that district got merged, he could run, and she decided to run for the Senate. You can see we have a sign here, Millicent Fenwick for Senate. She unfortunately did not understand statewide politics. She was well known in her district, but not throughout the state. She also had a challenger who many of you I know, Frank Lautenberg. He went on to beat Millicent Fenwick in 1982. Some attribute that campaign as one of the first nasty campaigns in politics. His chief criticism against her was her age, because back then she was 72. As you know, he went to serve well into his 80s. But also he was a self-made millionaire, and he was willing to spend his money in both markets. As you know, New Jersey is divided between the New York media market and the Philadelphia media market. And so he would spend money and rent planes and helicopters to be in both media markets in the same news cycle. She refused to do that. Some of her prior campaigns, she had a cap on how much she would spend. She easily won her races. She really didn't have a fight in many of her races. And everybody expected her to win. She was up, I think, 18 points in the polls in September. But on November, when she woke up the day after the election, she and many of the New Jersey voters were surprised that she didn't win, especially because she had support by folks like Ronald Reagan. He came to Flemington, New Jersey. He campaigned for her. It was a wonderful event. Every time I read the speech that he gave that day, I laugh. I was going to read it for you today, but I can't read it without laughing. But he just kind of told a story about how he gave a speech and nobody was clapping for him. And then the next speaker got up and spoke in Spanish. And so he just wanted to show his support, and he clapped and he clapped and he clapped. And then the person next to him whispered and said, "I don't think you should clap so much." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "Because they're translating what you said." Like he was clapping for his own speech. And so he was just kind of saying how Millicent is a hard act to follow. She speaks in many languages. And it was just it was a good camaraderie. Unfortunately, having Ronald Reagan's support wasn't enough, as I said, to have a Fenwick victory that year and for the Senate. But her political career was not over. Ronald Reagan appointed Millicent Fenwick to be the first ambassador to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization based in Rome. And Before that, the US always had a representative there, but he elevated it to an ambassadorship. So as a result, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization thought that Millicent Fenwick had a phone hot wired to the White House. They thought they were buddy-buddy because she became an ambassador. It was also the perfect assignment for her because not only did she care about the issues of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, but her sister, Mary, had been married to an Italian count. So she had a lot of friends and family in Rome. By that point, her sister had passed, but she still had a lot of connections, and she spoke Italian fluently and French fluently, which was the language then. And this is one of her many trips that she did as part of her ambassadorship there. And then as I wrap up, as I know we have several of her grandchildren with us participating via Zoom. And this picture is her first great grandchild, Spencer Reckford, who this was taken in 1989. So I think that means that this baby is 31 years old today. And I don't know if he's watching or not, but I think this is a good time for the Reckfords, if any of them are online. And I will just say one of the Reckfords you might actually even know, Jonathan Reckford. If any of you have ever donated to Habitat for Humanity and you get a letter and it's always signed by Jonathan Reckford, that is Millicent Fenwick's grandson. So, and then I'm going to conclude with a picture of Millicent Fenwick. The Bernardsville community rallied to erect the statue of her in 1996. It's one of the first statues of a woman outdoors. And if you look if you look on the right-hand side, you can see a bulge in her pocket. That is her pipe. And the artist did that intentionally. And she gets decorated for different holidays like Easter and all sorts of things. So the statue receives a lot of love today, just much as Representative Fenwick did in her time. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Eileen if I don't know how this works, if we can see any of the Reckfords or if they want to share a story or.
I don't see any questions, but if you have any questions here, we can take questions here. If anybody has any questions about Millicent Fenwick. I do.
Okay.
So she didn't graduate from high school and she didn't go to college, but she spoke all those languages.
Well, she had a nanny. So the nanny, I believe, taught her French. And then when she went to Spain with her father, she actually served as a translator between her father and the prime minister because she spoke Spanish so fluently. So she was just a natural. And then she picked up Italian, I'm assuming, when her sister married the Italian count.
Well, we have one comment here online from Carol Simon Levin. She says, I heard Millicent's statue got an RBG collar this month.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's appropriate. So for those of you who didn't hear what she said, somebody on Zoom said that they heard that the Millicent Fenwick statue got an RBG collar recently with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I don't. Yes.
So what exactly happened to you?
To me?
To you.
Oh, to Hugh Fenwick, her husband. Okay. Oh, so yes. So he, okay. That is quite a story. So what's interesting about, he really was the love of her life. And I believe that when she died, Millicent, that the letters exchanged between them during their separation were in her nightstand. I mean, I read these, I had, these letters, I'd seen them. But there was someone named Colonel Donovan, William Donovan. I think he's the founder of the CIA, if I get that correctly. Yes, say it again. The OSS, the predecessor of the CIA. Thank you. So quite a prominent person. He was their messenger, passing letters between the two of them during their separation. And Hugh did ask for him to take her, for her to take him back, but she had heard stories about kind of his gallivanting overseas. And I think she was very hurt and just moved on. So they did, like I said, he left in 1938. I don't think he came back. I think the only time she saw him was her daughter's wedding, Mary Reckford. And then there was something that happened about a year before she died. Hugh Fenwick did end up having a relationship with his father. And I think a year or two before Millicent passed, Hugh Fenwick was passing through Bernardsville and asked if he could stay, I think, with Hugo or something. And he didn't think that was appropriate because he was worried it would upset his mother. And he didn't ask her. And then later he told her the story, and he got the sense that she probably would have liked to have an opportunity to have seen. And he went on to remarry. And he has a child from his third marriage. So he ended up having 3 children. And that marriage, I believe, was a long one, marriage number 3. So
we have another question online. What did Millicent die of and what was the cause?
Okay, what did Millicent die of and what was the cause? She died September 16th, 1992, and her son said that she willed her own death. There were 3 things she wanted to do before she died. And let me say that she was in failing health. She had emphysema, arterial disease, so she had some ailments. And so 3 things she wanted to do. 1, she wanted to say goodbye in person, or she wanted to see her dear friend Jane Engelhardt in person. Jane Engelhardt came and visited on September 16th. She wanted to donate a ring that she had inherited from her beloved cousin, Mary Stevens Baird. And she wanted to donate that ring to the Newark Museum. And she wanted it to be a gift during life, not death. So he was away, and she said, is there any way you could contact him? They said no. He came back, I believe, I could be getting the dates wrong, but let's say Monday, September 14th, or maybe this, I don't know what day of the week the 16th was, but he came back. He sent someone to the house to get the ring, and it was later sold at auction for like $18,000. And that is what the museum used to set up their gem and jewel ring or exhibit, was from that ring. And the third thing she wanted to do, which I'm pretty sure wouldn't be on most people's lists, is to make sure she paid all of her bills. And she did that, and there was just one check that hadn't cleared at the time of her death, and ironically, that was her taxes. But once those 3 things were done, she actually had a caregiver who was a licensed nurse. She released the licensed nurse and got a registered nurse because she knew that only a doctor or a registered nurse could sign the death certificate. The registered nurse came that day, and she died that night. So I think, yeah, I don't know if there is such a thing as willing your own death, but if so, she seems to be the model for that.
Someone online mentions that Millicent is one of the many fascinating stories in No Stopping Us Now, The Adventures of Older Women in American History by Gail Collins.
Oh, yes. And Gail Collins has written a few op-eds about her. She did an op-ed about Lacey Davenport. And so thank you for that. And then did you have a question as well?
How did you find yourself writing a book about Millicent?
Yes. How did I write a book about it? So my mom, who's sitting here in the front row, she actually suggested it. I was a history major in college, and I needed a thesis topic. And the professor said to choose a subject that one day you wanted to write a book about. So he planted the seed, and I certainly never thought I would do that. But, I had a great time researching her and learning. There were no books about her. There were books about women in Congress, and she was like a chapter in there. And the more I read, the more I wanted to learn. And also there was great primary material available, not just through the family, but all of her congressional papers are at the Rutgers Library. One of her cousins, the library is named after him, another Stevens. And no one had ever looked through those papers. So for many of those boxes, I was the first one even opening them. So there was a lot of material and a great story to be told. I think what most people were surprised about, most people know about Millicent Fenwick and her congressional years, but in this book, she doesn't get elected till chapter 10. There's so much that happened in her life before then, everything from the Lusitania to Vogue to, her entrance into politics, really being a woman ahead of her time, facing challenges of being a single mother in the 30s and 40s with 2 children. So she really kind of paved the way. Yeah. So, okay.
So
Yes.
she be considered a liberal Republican?
Yes.
Right. And do you think things have kind of shifted the other
Yeah,
way?
so
Do you see her what place she'd be
I-
today?
I think she probably still would be a Republican. However, I think she would be a vocal Republican. I think she would be outspoken about things that she saw. that upset her. You know, she was always focused on people in public office, our role models and things of that nature. So I'd like to think that she never really cared what people thought, and she always spoke her mind. And so I think in this day and age, you know, that is something that would be welcome. And I think she would have been vocal about things that she agreed and disagreed with in her party.
Okay, well.
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you for bringing her to life. You had mentioned Condé Nast in Rhode Island. Some of my background is in retail. Can you, even though it's not about her, can you give an overview? Like, what do you know? Who is Condé Nast? And it was a person and
Sure.
children.
Okay, so my memory, I wrote this book a long time ago. My memory on Condé Nast isn't as great, but I do remember I read a biography of him by a woman named Caroline Seabaum, I believe. He was a publisher at the time that Millicent was involved with Vogue. Vogue and Vanity Fair had merged. Now they're two separate publications. I don't really remember too much about his personal life, to be honest, but he was a publisher. So today we know Condé Nast kind of as a conglomerate of magazines, but it actually started out, it's named after a person, and very influential, very successful with his magazines. And Vogue certainly had the pulse on society. There, Millicent worked for an editor there, Edwin Chase, who had been there for decades. So she really kind of was really at the epicenter of that organization. She did have interactions with him, and he thought highly enough. He is the one, I believe, that interviewed her for that job. So she did make a positive impression. But I think for more information, the biography on Condé Nast is what I would recommend. Yes.
What is her home now? Is it a private residence?
So after she died, her son and his wife lived there for, well, actually, they did live there for many years. He had passed, unfortunately, away from lung cancer, and his widow lived there, and eventually it was sold. And it is a private residence today. I believe it was sold to folks from another country. And I believe that they had, the family put in place, I'm going to not say this articulately, but something related to the land. So some sort of preservation, something. So it can't be developed or anything like that. I think it has to stay a residence. And so I don't know what's happened to it since it was sold as a private residence.
Okay, so.
Thank you.
I just want to let everybody know that Amy's book is for sale, her biography of Millicent Fenwick, and she would be happy to sign those for you. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, everybody out in Zoom land too, especially.
Thank you.
We're going to go now.